In this tutorial series, we'll be exploring the different video scopes that are included as part of the Lumetri color suite found inside of Adobe Premiere. Scopes are a powerful tool that will help you make great looking images and are most often essential for every colorist to use when color correcting or color grading. For the first time, Lumetri makes it possible to display multiple scopes at the same time in Adobe Premiere, and they include the waveform, RGB parade, histogram, YUV vector scope, and an HSL vector scope. We'll explore each scope and what their functions are, along with global scope settings, but before we begin, let me first point out something called the trace. The trace is the visual pattern you see here and is a representation of the pixel information in your image. What the trace represents specifically will vary from scope to scope, but in general, it displays brightness and color levels in your images. Let's explore the different scopes available in Adobe Premiere. The waveform scope is helpful with evaluating the exposure of an image. The scope is read from left to right corresponding to the image, and the trace information is read from top to bottom with the highlights at the top and the shadows at the bottom. The RGB parade scope is helpful for evaluating color balance. It is similar to the waveform, except that the exposure readings are broken out into the separate color channels of red, green, and blue. The default vector scope in Lumetri is the YUV vector scope and is helpful with analyzing the hue and chroma in an image. It is read like a color wheel with white at the center, while more saturated or vivid colors are further away from the center. The HSL vector scope looks similar to the YUV vector scope, but differs in that it analyzes luma in addition to the hue and chroma. The histogram scope is helpful for evaluating exposure and even more useful for evaluating the color balance and illegal luma levels in your images. The trace is read from top to bottom with the shadows at the bottom and the highlights at the top. The trace is then displayed as the volume of pixels represented at each luma level. This will make more sense as we dive in deeper to learn each scope. If you followed along with the setting up a timeline tutorial, you may already have the scopes visible from selecting the color interface layout. But if the Lumetri color scopes aren't open, you can go to the window menu and select Lumetri scopes. With the scopes windows open, you can select the scopes you want to see by clicking on this wrench and then choosing one or all of the available scopes. Let's select each scope, starting with the vector scope HLS, then the vector scope YUV, the histogram, RGB parade, and then the waveform. If you want to turn the scopes off, repeat the same steps, but this time uncheck the ones you don't want to display. Let's turn off the vector scope HLS and histogram. There, that should do it. Adobe Premiere lets you display any combination of scopes in the window and has also included some scope presets that make it quick to populate your window like so. Alternatively, you can right-click on the scopes to open or close a particular scope. In addition to the scope presets within the wrench menu, there is an option to select a color space for your scopes. Knowing which color space is right for your project might seem confusing, but don't worry. The different settings are Rec 601 for standard definition, Rec 709 for high definition, and Rec 2020 for HDR, wide color gamut, and 4K ultra high definition. Okay, another setting you may find helpful is one that lets you change how bright your scopes are displayed. To change the brightness level, click on the wrench icon, go down to brightness, and select either bright, normal, or dimmed. For this tutorial, I'll keep it on normal. Next, there is a setting called Clamp Signal, which is located just to the right of the wrench icon. Toggling this option on will limit or clamp down on any signal that is over 100 IRE. Moving forward, we'll keep this option turned off so that if we have any images that exceed 100 IRE, we'll be able to correct them. One last detail I want to share is that Adobe gives you the ability to view the scopes as 8-bit, floating point, or HDR. By default, the scopes display 8-bit data, which shows chroma and luma values ranging from 0 to 255. If you are working with 8-bit images, it is a good idea to set the scopes to display 8-bit. And if you're working with images that are 10-bit or higher, I recommend that you change the scopes to display floating point. And finally, if working with HDR or high dynamic range media, change the scopes display to HDR. In the following tutorials, we'll explore each of the scopes in greater detail.